I'm just going to be talking about some sort of high level stuff in terms of ecology. I'm not really going to be delving into bugs or fish or anything like that. I'm actually going to be talking more about, we go out and collect this data, what are we actually going to then do with it in order to inform sort of water management decisions. So this is part of some work that I did in combination with a couple of colleagues for the Goiter Research Partnership and Research Institute, and this was looking at water management in the Mount Lofty Ranges, specifically around the WAPs. So water allocation planning requires us to balance risks. Requires us to balance risks to the environment, to balance risks to society, and balance risks to economic uses of water. And the way that we sort of do that is we can use a risk assessment framework and try and just piece it all together. Now, what my sort of role is in this space is actually to inform that ecological risk assessment. Now, one of the key things that's really important to spell out at this point is we're not necessarily interested, although we are interested, but we can't really talk about the absolute risk to the ecosystem, because the ecosystem exists at a level of risk. There are certain things that have happened, that have changed, that we cannot do too much about. But what we have got is we have got a position or a point that we are aiming for. So the community, the boards, everyone gets together and says, okay, these are the objectives. These are what we want to achieve from our water-dependent ecosystems. And then we can say, okay, if that's what you want to achieve, then this is the risk to achieving that. So that's what this sort of process is about. Now, in terms of risk assessment and objectives and all this sort of stuff, there is a really common objective. If you read the literature around this sort of stuff, you'll find that this objective appears in over 75% of these sort of water management plans, and in fact environmental management in general. That is, we want to maintain current condition and improve it if possible. Now, it's a really common high-level objective because it's considered a catch-all. If things don't get any worse, then we've won, but if we can actually make them a little bit better along the way, then that's even better. So, it's a really good objective, but unfortunately you can't really assess it in any empirical way. It's sort of one of these things that you come along to a high-level meeting and say, the objective is to maintain and improve. We had a look and we reckon it's pretty good, so tick, and we'll move on. What we wanted to do is we wanted to actually see if we could come up with a way that we could actually empirically test this using real data. So we sat down and knocked our heads together, and we came up with a bit of a different approach, which is what I'm presenting here today. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to present it as a worked example because the data that we have to operate this isn't quite ready. So I'm just going to be presenting the framework we're going to be using, and hopefully in the near future you'll be able to see the actual results. So, as I said before, in the Mount Lofty Ranges we need to balance different levels of risks. We have the ecological objectives. Now, the reason that we're looking for a new approach is the old method that was used in the generation of the current WAPs used an expert opinion approach. Now, this was due to the fact that there wasn't actually too much monitoring data at the time. So they needed to go with the best available information that was at hand, and that was getting all the experts into a room and sort of drawing out as much information from them as they could. However, it doesn't have any sort of numbers behind it, and of course when you're talking to the community, you're talking to scientists, having numbers is always a really good thing, because you can actually say, look, here's a graph, here's a number, here's something absolute. So, challenge. We wanted to create an improved risk assessment method that was empirical, data-driven, transparent, and able to assess against that high-level objective, because, let's face it, if we can sort of tick against that high-level objective, then that's going to be a good thing to say to people. Now, the whole sort of process is based on our ability to predict ecological condition. Now, that was arguably the larger component of the Goiter project that I was working on. So Dr. Sally Maxwell, one of my colleagues, who's, I think, actually presenting the work which I'm talking about in another session, I think tomorrow or Friday. We looked at developing response models for macroinvertebrates. One of our colleagues, Dave Schmar, developed response models for fish, and another colleague, Jason Nicole, developed response models for vegetation. Now, those models are still churning their way through the final sort of process, so unfortunately they're not ready, which is why we don't have a big proper data set to use. But we do have some other stuff, so I'll get into that in a little bit. The model outputs are trait groups, the proportion of trait groups in different, under different flow scenarios. So macroinvertebrates, there's a whole suite of them. There's about 900 different macroinvertebrates that exist in the Mount Lofty Ranges, and they all respond differently to different changes in flow. Some go up, some go down, some don't really change. So we needed a way to figure out what's sort of good or bad in that. When you think about what's good or bad, one of the first things that comes into mind is, well, I reckon that looks pretty good, so that's good. And all these look pretty bad, so therefore they're bad. That reference condition approach is sort of an older style approach that we didn't really want to be using in this sense for the development of this risk assessment. There's too many sort of hairs on it when you actually start to dig into it in a really detailed sense about trying to actually define reference condition. Arguably there are very few reference condition systems left anywhere in the world. Certainly in South Australia we have one river which is contained fully in a national park, which is on Kangaroo Island, which you would argue, I'm not too sure how well that relates to the Mount Lofty Ranges. So we can look at sensitive species or ubiquitous species. So some macroinvertebrates will grow anywhere. So I'm sure that you've all had the experience of leave a bucket outside, fills with water, 2 weeks later it's full of mosquito larvae. They're a ubiquitous species. They exist pretty much anywhere. But we also have other species which are very rare. They don't occur terribly often. So we can sort of look and say, okay, well, those more sensitive species, those rarer species, do we want to see those increasing and we want to see those ubiquitous, more tolerant species becoming less prevalent? Maybe, who knows? But at the end of the day, we just want to come back to this key objective. We want to maintain the current community and improve it if possible. So all that sort of stuff about this species versus that species, reference condition to something else, sort of fades away into the background because we just need to know what the current condition is and then have some sort of way that we can measure improved. Now, what we do is we use hydrological modelling to produce different flow scenarios that we can then feed into predictive models that will give us predictive outputs. Now, this is where I would like to show you, we use the response models we developed. These are the predicted outcomes from the different flow regimes, and therefore this is the information. Unfortunately, we don't, so I'm just sort of going to present it in a really high-level sort of sense. The flow data that we use, we have a modelled current. So if you take a surface water model, you give it all the conditions that have existed up to this point, and it will spit out a modelled current scenario. The next one that we use is a no dams scenario or a no extraction scenario. So this is basically where you have the same landscape, but all the dams are gone, all the water pumping is gone, and now you just have a system which flows. It's still modified, of course, by land clearance and that sort of thing, but it's the least impacted scenario that we have. And then the third scenario, you can use any number of test scenarios. So you could have something like in the Mount Lofty Ranges, low flow releases, or you could say we're actually going to cut allocations, or we're going to remove dams, or we're going to increase allocations, or whatever. We're only going to allow people to extract water every second Tuesday for 25 minutes. Whatever the scenario you want to run, you can feed it into your surface water model and it spits out some numbers. So, why is this useful? Well, the process that we used, or that we developed, talks about running data through this process. So you have a hydrological model, and that runs through the hydrological model. So you run it, that produces some surface water flow, some daily flow data. You run that through your hydro-ecological response models. That gives you a modelled ecological community. We run that through a principal component analysis, actually it's a principal component ordination, and that gives you a point in 2 dimensions. Now what this point represents is that community in space. So it takes all of that information about the community, collapses it down into several numbers, or basically 2 numbers, an x and a y, and puts it in 2-dimensional space. So that's where that community is. That point represents that community under current conditions. Now, if you run it through using NODAM's data, so we have our hydrological model, we plug all the NODAM's information into it, that spits out daily flows for NODAMs, we run it through the hydroecological response models, we get our modelled ecological community, we run it through the principal component ordination, and it spits out another point. So that's that point. That represents that community in space. Then finally, you take your test scenario. So just say this is people taking their full allocation. So now you have 3 points in space. So this is your current scenario, this is your NODAM's scenario, and this is your test scenario. Now this becomes really handy because now you can actually quantify to maintain and or improve. So if we take this scenario here, we have our NODAMs, we have our current, and we have 2 test cases. So if we say test case 1 is low flow bypasses. We want to put bypasses on all the dams and we're going to restore that low flow through the system. So we can see that we are moving from current away from current to this point here. So we have failed our maintain. We have a distance that we have travelled away from our current, therefore we have failed to maintain the current situation. But that's not a bad thing in reality because we've installed low flow bypasses, we're actually intending to change it. The improvement talks about the difference between the red line here and the dotted blue line here. So the current distance away from the NODAMs, and the reason we use the NODAMs is that's the least impacted one we have. It's not a target by any stretch of the imagination. No one's saying we're going to rip up all the dams. It's just a point in space that we can use as a reference. But we've got this distance here is longer than this distance here. So we've moved closer to that least impacted scenario, therefore improvement. And these are actually numbers that we can quantify. We can actually give numbers to these. So we've got your second scenario here, which might represent full allocation. That's actually representing a change and not an improvement. So I'll just speed through this stuff quite quickly. You can't do it over a single year because that's relatively pointless. So what we did, when we sort of trialled this with some other data, we've used a 30-year window that takes into account both wet and dry periods. You run multiple models so that you can get an idea of the spectrum of which you're dealing with. So you can have a really bad year and a really bad scenario and a really good year and a good scenario. And it provides a bit of a scale. So what I mean by a scale is if you've got sort of lower deviation down one end and higher deviation, this is for the improvement metric. You have your NODAMs sort of realm, your window of sites in here. Then you might have, say, a 15% allocation scenario. This is based on some stuff we did for the Barossa Valley. 20% allocation, 35% allocation. Then the different scenarios with threshold flow rates attached. And then you might have your current level. So you can see that if you look, say, for the example of threshold flow rates, they're starting to move towards this NODAM scenario, which represents a general improvement in condition, which is quite good because now we can start to tie it back into our risk stuff. So basically the output to this, it provides you with empirical numbers that you can then use for risk assessment. It's average across years, which means it's really good because it takes into account wet and dry and all that sort of thing. And then you can actually average different scenarios and different sites to look at how things are changing at different spatial scales. The advantages is able to use actually any ecologically relevant data set. So we set this up to take into account that macroinvertebrate community condition, but you could actually use flow metrics that are ecologically relevant. You could use anything, and it doesn't have to actually be anything to do with flow. You could use this for any ecologically relevant data set for any ecosystem. The metrics are really easy to interpret. Maintain, the smaller the maintain value, the better. And then improvement, obviously a positive is good and negative is bad. It's quantitative and it's simple and fast. The sort of downsides areas we need to work on, it's all relative. So at the moment, improvement is just improvement. We don't know what that actually means. It needs to be run afresh every time you add new data. Principal component ordination, you can't just add one single point in, you have to redo the whole thing. And we've got to figure out about uncertainty, how we build that in. So, obviously there's uncertainty that comes from hydrological models. How does that then propagate through this system so that we end up with a number and an uncertainty bound around it? We haven't quite got that one licked, but we've got a few ideas there. Cool.
Thanks, Steve.